All right, welcome everyone to our second open discussion. This week we're talking about digital innovation, and I'm Allan Tate. With me today is Christopher Reichert. We will be your hosts.
Good morning.
On the agenda this week is the two panels. We have Carrie Perlson, who talked about protecting your digital innovations from cyber attack, and also Abby Lundberg, who talked about rapid shift in talent and knowledge acquisition. And I will say that we have reviewed your questions and comments, both live on the Zoom meetings as well as the comments posted to the community. They were very helpful in us preparing. So that's what's on the agenda. What's not on the agenda, this is not a place for feedback about the program, platform, or how-to. If you have questions about that, please go to the help desk and post your question there. I do encourage everybody to read our community guidelines, but in a nutshell, it is to be supportive, generous, and constructive in your comments. All participants will be on mute. You can use the raise hand feature on the bottom of Zoom and when you're ready to make a comment or a question, and we will unmute you and call on you. I do ask that if and when you are speaking, you turn your video on. It makes for a better post-production. And we've organized our conversation today in the three general topic areas: the hybrid office, acquiring and developing talent, and cybersecurity. I put cybersecurity at the end for a couple of reasons, but primarily because the International Partners booth had a roundtable on Tuesday evening where Kalpesh Seth led a discussion that went deeper into cybersecurity. So a bunch of people have had a opportunity to talk about that. But we'll take about 15 minutes for each of these general topic areas, and people can make brief remarks. I will say, Christopher and I both want to encourage everyone to raise your hand and speak. This session is about hearing your voice. I mean, Christopher and I can talk about this for an hour, but that is not the point. The point is to hear you. And so with that, Christopher, how are you doing?
Good morning, everyone. Happy Earth Day. Here, it's very chilly in Philadelphia, but it was very warm a few days ago, so it kind of reminds us how important our environment is. It can really affect our day-to-day. So welcome to everyone. By the way, I'm very impressed by the creativity of some of the images I'm seeing here. Steve Max Patterson, I like that image, and also Ben Gundry, I like that bird you've got up there. So hope that creativity translates into some of the questions we're gonna hear, hopefully from you all. So welcome. So Allan, these topics this last week have been really interesting, between the hybrid office, talent, developing talent. I think that's a challenge for startups, large organizations, and I think that's been a huge challenge, both hybrid office and the talent over this last year. And cybersecurity, it's just such a perennial topic. How about you? Do you have any kind of experiences with either hybrid office or developing talent, or or any nasty cybersecurity stories?
Yeah, so with the hybrid office, that specific conversation resonated with me in the sense that for me, I have been in a remote work environment since the late 1990s. Back it was like 1998, I was tapped by Schneider Electric to help set up a global development operation. Back in those days, there was a lot of mergers and acquisitions happening in the industrial automation space. And so we became a French company with a German arm and a U.S. arm, and we had to bring all these different development organizations together. Back in those days, we used a product called ClearCase Multisite. We were using NetMeeting I don't know how many people remember that, but it was basically audio only. I remember sitting at my desk with a headset on, and I could share my screen, so I would literally take minutes of the meetings that people could view, but we couldn't see each other's faces. One thing that I really do recall, though, that was very helpful is that, we were bringing together three different cultures, the French, the Germans, the U.S., and I started out by flying everybody to a common place. Well, we picked France, but, it could have been anywhere. And gave people a chance to really get to know each other, because there were cultural differences between us, language differences between us. And I really felt that, building that initial friendship, I think, and knowing each other, knowing the way people thought. And then when we went back to work remotely, it really helped because, you had broken bread with this person, maybe shared a few drinks, and it made a big difference. I will say, too, that there was comments about the meeting after the meeting, and this was definitely a problem. In those days when we met, people would have to go into dedicated conference rooms. So we had this expensive video equipment, so we would go into our conference room, the French, the Germans go into theirs. And of course, as soon as the video went off, everybody had their own discussions. And so that was a problem then. And I think it's a problem now as we struggle with, setting up the hybrid office.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Years ago, I read a study that talked about different ways technology can draw us in or push us away. So if you have, for example, with your partner, if you start emailing or Facebook messaging your partner, you tend to be pushing them away. Whereas if you do the same thing for, say, an old college friend or someone like that, you draw them closer. So it's really important to choose the medium, for the audience. And I think that's been a challenge, obviously, this last year where we really haven't had much choice, besides a phone call. It's really been this kind of Zoom pandemic life. But the software development, in my experience, it is a multi-site experience, a multi-site team. So even pre-pandemic, you had teams that were geographically dispersed. So in some ways, I think that area of the economy or that work experience probably hasn't changed as much as other businesses or other industries. And I think those are the areas where I think that as we come out of the pandemic, we'll be having more robust discussions about whether or not, the forced remote and Zoom, here we are on Zoom yet again, is going to be something they're going to keep, or is it something that they're going to be migrating back more towards in-person or blended or hybrid?
Yeah. Well, so I'm just going to inject another comment here that, we were instructed by Klaus yesterday to become chief storytellers. And so I hope that some of the folks in the audience will raise their hand using Zoom. Again, you go down to reactions, and then click on raise hand. We definitely want to hear your stories about the hybrid office and what experiences you've had with coping with where we are today. So.
Yeah, absolutely. The value in this conversation is hearing from all of us, not just the two of us. Although, as you know, Allan, you and I can talk wax lyrical, for a long time.
We have our first raised hand, so I'm going to unmute Allie. You have to unmute yourself.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome.
I believe technology is going to scale. We would have remote, everybody would be remote, and it's going to be like sitting in a different cubicle and offices. For example, management and everybody else is going to sit down. I mean, they can see each other, they can communicate. But the only problem would be if you are living in one bedroom and you got two kids, that's going to be a problem. But that's going to be, if you do have a pets. But technology is driving towards that direction. If you remember that 30, 40 years ago, you would see that in one floor, everybody sitting in the desk beside each other's. Then after that, they were introducing the cubicle. Then after that, the individual offices. The same way the technology is going to be coming back, and everybody as a group, they're going to be in one virtual call, and they looks like they sit beside each other. But there is another problem, would be the culture. Even though the culture is, we've seen that the law of outsourcing from India and other part of the country, but it has been issues. I've seen that it is the issues, even though in the software development, they set up the mind. I think it's going to be 25 to 30% remote until we would have virtual office, like, as I said, in one office, in one group, they would be sitting beside each other. It seems like that they are in a different cubicle. But for now, it's going to be the management, the CIO, C-levels, they have to adjust. How are they going to scale their organization regarding that point? I'm out.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that as one thing I've observed with some of my colleagues in large organizations and small, but particularly large organizations, which historically had those big, footprints of desks, whether they were cubicles or other varieties of open space and then breakout rooms. Over the last year, a lot of them have gone to really breaking it down into core teams that would come in for 3 or 4 or 5 days, and then they would go away for, say, 2 weeks or so as part of the pandemic quarantining, so that they still had that core team who could have the face-to-face in person, but in a very controlled way. And I think that I can see some of that continuing even as we move forward. So that huge, everyone coming in in the morning and everyone going home at night will probably not come back in a hurry. I don't know what other people think and what they're seeing.
Well, I have a couple of reactions to what Ali said, and one is that getting back to last week with Elizabeth Reynolds and talking about equity in terms of people having access to the internet. There are issues with getting access to the physical infrastructure, but also having a space at home. It's not just, kids in the bedroom, but also, people who are in cramped housing. It can be hard to work remote. And then I will just say that the question of doing development with India, I won't tell the story now, but it reminds me of my time at Walmart when we had a team in the U.S. and a team in India. And that was another era, but there were a lot of complexities with that. We do have David, who has raised his hand. I'm going to unmute him. And let's hear from David.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to talk to this whole, I guess I'm going to say, the big disruption that the pandemic caused and what it kind of forced businesses into. I started a small consulting firm in 1986 and made the unusual decision to have a distributed office. So I didn't use subcontractors. I had employees who worked for me, who had offices in their homes. And if I tell you that the technology wasn't what we have today, that's an understatement. I mean, we're talking about, 9600 baud dial-up modems and things like that. We had to send files around. It was a very different world. But I saw the efficiencies and I saw the direction that I thought things were moving, and I thought this was a good idea. And it proved right. I mean, clients included MIT and Harvard and many other organizations. And we had very long relationships. And I had staff who were with me more than 20 years as employees in a distributed office. And what I wanted to talk to specifically is that I think the hybrid model, which we're literally at the early stages of learning what it involves, offers some tremendous advantages. I do not see it going away at all. Among the things that it makes possible is if you have a large organization and you have a person in California and a person in Europe and a person in New York, and they need to meet to go over something. The old way is two of them got on a plane and went to one of their offices. A lot of big organizations spend a lot of money and time getting people together. And now with Zoom, these people can get together within minutes if they are available. I used to have a saying once we started getting remote access to client systems, we used to say we can be on site in 60 seconds. If someone had a problem with one of their databases we were supporting or whatever, we could be on site in 60 seconds. When you're dealing with a fleet, you can't do that. You're dealing with a much more productive day because you're spending much less time in your car. You're not spending money on parking. Companies can have less real estate. You don't need as many square feet. So what we're faced with now is, now that we've had a taste, we've seen what technology can do, I think organizations have to figure out, where can we use the remote technology? What things are just as well done remotely? What things do we need to bring people together for? I, for instance, in my distributed organization, had a monthly on-site staff meeting. I had regular team building exercises. I took people out with their families to dinner fairly often. There were a lot of things you do so that people feel cohesive. It's still much less expensive than renting 100 square feet for every employee all the time. So I think we're at the very beginning stages of a learning curve to figure out how to use all these technologies effectively so that our organizations can be more effective than they were either fully remote or all in person.
Yeah, and I would just say, as I think about what you were saying, there are positive impacts to using Zoom in terms of less energy usage, which we all know is beneficial these days. And, even setting up this conference, I set up a Zoom office hours where people who are doing different aspects could just drop in, and I found that to be very effective. I'm going to move on to Kevin. Kevin has his hand raised, and let's see what he has to say. And we have another hand raised after Kevin, so we're moving to some questions. This is good.
Thanks, Allan. I find the conversation, and probably not surprised since it's a group of CIOs, but what works for IT may or may not work for some other function. But that being said, I think there's little doubt that the hybrid office is here to stay. And the only question is, where's the needle fall? It's not going to be all of one or all of the other, unless there's some sort of cult personality that drives it. If the CEO says everything will be in person, well then, okay, guess what? That's what's going to happen. And I think when you get those sort of, in today's world, dictatorial type of edicts, that's going to go back to some of the other topics around recruitment and retention. I look at my own personal example of, I was CIO for Staples Europe for several years. And I did have the option actually to get on the plane and fly to one of the 17 countries where I had people in. But what we found was, after the initial socialization and relationship building, I think people actually preferred the desktop video. And there's a lot of good things about that. One of them, which is, I'm not particularly bilingual or trilingual or 17-way lingual. And while English was the official language, it was a second language for the vast majority of the people that I actually had the pleasure to work with. So what we were able to do was share screens, take notes, make the commitments. And it wasn't an after the meeting fact. And so I only bring up that particular story because I think what we really need to find is the set of practices, behaviors, and disciplines that make virtual meetings work. You mentioned a second ago about having standby rooms. I think Cisco calls that presence. Hey, are you here? Are you available for drop-ins? It's the behavior. It's okay. You can walk up to somebody in the cube, and if they see you, they're going to naturally say, hey, what's up? Or I'm busy now. But how do you translate those types of behaviors that you see in the office that allow for the casual conversation to become the casual conversation in a virtual circumstance. So the notes I wrote down at the end of the day is, what's the purpose of the meeting? What's the collateral you need in that meeting? And an example of that will come up in a second, because everything's digital now, but some people do still want a paper brochure if you're in a marketing circumstance. Yeah. And what are the personalities of the attendees? And I think if you think about how that fits in a IT role, how that might fit in a cross-functional team role, and then I think as CIOs, we always have to ask ourselves a question: does that work for the other functions, like marketing, business development, sales? Do those same techniques and methods work across all functions within your enterprise?
Christopher, any reaction to that? Otherwise, I'm going to move on to Zoya.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that you're spot on in saying that what works for one industry and may not work for other industries. Technology kind of, in some ways, has that as part of its DNA. But I'm wondering, as you were talking, I was thinking about other technologies that could be applied to other industries that could help with the. I guess bridging the gap, for want of a better term. Whether that's artificial intelligence, or there are some of the headsets that people use for being present in a sort of 3D way. And I think a lot of those are in their early stages. Maybe they're kind of seen more as games or entertainment. But I think that there's an opportunity to introduce those to physically transport you. But even to the earlier comment about David's comment about being remote from day one. I had that as well in the early 90s in Australia, where I was in charge of 600 desktops, but I was based in Sydney and some were out in Perth and some in New Zealand as well. So getting there was a challenge in dial-up times, but it could be done, and I think that's transferable to other industries. So,
all right, let's bring Zoya into the conversation. Zoya, I am unmuting you.
Thank you, Allan. Great discussion. And I am bringing a little bit of a different perspective, and then I'll end up with a question to the audience. My perspective is as an educator of IT professionals who come out of my course in Harvard Extension School with a master's degree in information systems or enterprise architecture. This is what I've learned when they go out to interview at companies remotely. The style has changed. Instead of someone scanning, they are almost disappointed. They worked so hard on obtaining the master's degree, and almost nobody now pays. Hiring managers barely scan their resumes. Instead, mid-sized startups, early-stage startups, and even large companies now switch to giving assignments, giving projects to candidates. 2 stages of projects: team projects, hacking, something that has to be done in a virtual world, but a team experience or an individual challenge experience, something that is done prior to bringing a candidate in or any even interviews with hiring managers. So I can attest that the challenge of meeting the team face-to-face always works. In my course, I have a on-campus weekend that, of course, we couldn't do this year, but on-campus weekend in the middle of a Zoom-based online course does wonders to a team. Now, my question, but now we have to do the same experience, team huddle, individual challenging project on Zoom. How do our CIOs address it? And that is not just technology. It is hiring anybody into a remote environment for work. How do people do that?
Any thoughts, Christopher? Otherwise, we have Pat up next.
Yeah, I would love to hear also from other CIOs or technology or professionals here about to that question. How do you do that? I think it's remotely. Doing it all remotely. There, at some point, I do think as the nature of our species is that we want to meet in person at some point, but maybe that's delayed. Maybe that's handled in a different way.
Well, I definitely like to meet in person, although I do remember the first time that I realized I was friends with somebody that I had never met. It was an interesting feeling. Pat, I'm bringing you in.
Hey, Allan. Hey, Christopher. Nice to see you guys. And Zoya, I love that you put me right after Zoya because I want to talk about the interview piece because it's something where I live and breathe every single day. But before I do that, I want to talk about an overused term. That's culture. So, and I apologize, I'm looking down. I actually tried to write notes so I'd keep my train of thought clear and crisp. So culture is something that's overused, but this is really important. I've worked in a few places where the interest in connecting people and in growing a team is talked about, but isn't necessarily put into action because it seems like there should be an easy fix for that. This is where culture comes in, and culture is something that is actually created by how a manager and senior managers act and how they relate to people and react to people, not what they say, but actually how they act and relate. So I think in a case of remote work, you need to be, as a senior leader, making it a point to be a manager of people. That's different than being a manager, but being a manager of people. They should be the same thing, but they aren't necessarily the same thing. So making sure that you're connecting with people, that you are rewarding based on merit so that people who are far away from you and you can't monitor are doing the right things, and you're rewarding so they continue to do the right things, which puts incentives front and center and proper KPIs front and center. And to Zoya's point about these skills, right now, people are very focused on interviewing based on the skills you've already got versus the trajectory of the skills. And I'm seeing a lot of the same things, Zoya, where people are being required to make presentations about how they make ice cream or how they do this or how they do that versus having a conversation in an interview. So there's a lot on the line that has to do with cultural shifts that are being explored, and having managers take it seriously that they're managing people, not data, not information. They could be doing that, but senior level people are managing people. Proper KPIs need to be in place. I'll tell you, as someone that has lived in Nashua, New Hampshire for most of my adult life and commuted into the greater Boston area, I have not missed having to do that in the past year. I absolutely loved either not commuting. And so I think there is a great solution for people for saving money and lowering stress by doing the remote work. Last thing, Canderful, the company the nonprofit that I'm working on, it's all about interview training for military, and we teach it remote. We've taught it remote since before the pandemic hit, and it was easy to see the shift that would occur to remote interviewing, and a lot of companies, including Amazon, are doing it successfully. Anyway, I will back down there. Thank you so much for letting me kind of give you a whole bunch of stuff.
Now, that's great, Pat. I think you touched on a lot of topics that blend, I think, between the two panels, the two topics of the three, the hybrid office and the acquiring and developing talent, really effectively. Klaus from yesterday's panel talked specifically about when he's interviewing people. You know, the resume is one perspective, but really what matters is, you know, that's the past view. And then there's, you know, the real question is like, what are you bringing, both from experience, yes, but also from an outlook, maybe an intellectual curiosity to a position. So I think that is difficult. I think from a hiring perspective, I'd love to hear what other people are facing in terms of hiring and acquiring talent with, you know, you obviously have to start somewhere, which is their experience. But how do you translate that from someone who could be, you know, who doesn't have a learning mindset, who may not have a learning mindset, and how do you figure out whether or not they are bringing a wealth of experience, but are they going to translate that into what the organization needs next, which may not be defined?
Yeah, all good points. So let's bring in another voice. Minor, I'm going to ask you to unmute, and let's hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Allan. Again, great panel. Thanks for all the comments that folks have brought forward. We've hired probably 30 people remotely in the last year. And this is in all locations. We've brought interns in. I think on the positive side, we've been able to get people involved in the interview process that hadn't traditionally been. So, I've had a long-term group of employees that have worked remotely, and they had historically not been involved in the process. So on the positive end, we've been able to bring them in. We've gone to more online techniques for evaluating the technical capabilities. So previously, we'd done a lot of in-person stuff. We were able to use technology for that. So that's been really helpful. The biggest challenge I see is around understanding the cultural fit. It's a can do, will do, and fit when I'm hiring. And that fit has been really difficult for us to identify. And when I look at our metrics, we've had a significantly higher reject rate. So where we've made an offer and the candidate is reneged or rejected the offer. And so assessing whether that person fits into your organization, I find actually really difficult to do in the remote environment. You want that in-person interview. People aren't always 100%, honest when they're in interviews, right? And it's hard to assess those types of things. So I think that's where I've seen it not work as well as my in-person.
So Minor, I have a question for you. To me, and also I think this goes maybe to David Kahn's comment in the chat room about how, for example, MIT interviewed undergraduates 100% virtually this year. Do you think that the hiring for a specific role, which you have a defined need for, the job description, do you think that's effective remotely? But then how do you then hire people who are going to be able to, how do you glean in the remote hiring or in the remote students for that matter, people who are going to not only do what's needed today, but be ready to do what's needed tomorrow?
I think it's a challenge. I did all my EC interviews, remotely as well. It was great for me because I was able to interview students. It was easier for the students to do the interviews that way. I think they're actually a little bit more comfortable. So I found that there was a certain openness that I would get out of the students. But when I hire people, I'm rarely hiring them for the current job. I'm hiring them for the next job and the growth and the potential. And I think that's been where it's been difficult, to assess on the video interviews. So again, we've had better success with our junior talent and the junior hires. So when I look at like our intern, we did a full internship, everything was remote. We're on our second wave, everything will be remote. And we've been very happy with that. We've had return interns coming back, the junior talent that we've hired. It's those seniors, the managers, and the people who are going to lead the organizations. It's taken a lot longer to do that. When I look at the people that we brought into the organization, all the senior people, somebody knew already. So when I think of like going out into the market and hiring somebody that we don't know in the network, I found it really difficult.
Christopher, we have Zoya has her hand up, so I'm going to ask her to unmute. I think she wants to follow up.
Actually, Allan, I forgot to lower my hand. I don't have any comment right now. Sorry.
Well, we've got Ali here, but I'd be curious to hear, David, if you want to add any comments to the interview process for choosing the best students, and I think I want to come back to something that Pat talked about, which is not only raw talent, if you will, proven through their high school or whatever their experience is, but also how that might feed into eventually to the culture of MIT in this case, but I think it's a general question for other people, the type of employee that will fit into the culture. All
right. Well, hopefully, David, you can raise your hand, but in the meantime, I have Ali. I'm going to ask to unmute.
As far as the interview, based on what my experience is, I would look at the background of the people, then based on 60% of their background, then 40% based on if they had the experience. of the working with the other colleagues in the remote and how much experience they do have. That's how I would select the candidates. And because a lot of candidates, they cannot work by themselves, or they do have backgrounds, but they don't know how to resolve the issue and the culture of the organizations. I would look at how was their background was based on the remote working with the group, 40% and 60%, I would put it based on the background of the technology or whatever the nature of the job is. That's what I would put as far as that, because a lot of people, they cannot work remote by themselves. I've seen that in the organizations. When they are in remote, almost they are lost. I'm out.
Yeah, I mean, so I definitely have seen that the ability to work remote and independently really does depend on the individual, and so there is no one size fits all for sure. We do have David back. I'm going to ask if we can continue this conversation that Christopher brought up. David, you're on.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to talk a bit about this whole remote interviewing. It was a very interesting process this past year, interviewing undergraduates. I talked to a few people in other countries who I obviously would not have been able to easily interview in person. And it partly helped us deal with the fact that we had this year, I think, over 30,000 candidates applied. So it was a significant increase. I think we used to get low 20s. So being able to handle that number of people, I think that does all kinds of things to the math of the yield and things like that. As I commented in the chat, when people are not sure they're going to get a job, they're going to apply to a lot of places and interview as strongly as they can everywhere. And so it really is a complete I'm going to say it's a discontinuity in the labor market as a whole as all this is happening. Plus, with working remotely, we have Boston people applying for San Francisco jobs, which didn't used to happen. So there's all of this that takes place. And I'm going to say there's an extra piece I'm going to throw in as a wrinkle that I don't know if people are thinking about. I'm going to call it the mythical difference between a contractor and an employee. Because that is many companies in there, and I realize culture is a difficult word to use, but many companies have practices in place where contractors are less members of the team than employees. And I found that interesting because while my people were my employees, we were contractors to our clients. And we had people getting promoted and new people taking on their jobs. My team was the continuity in the departments we supported because I had some people supporting the same people for more than a decade, but none of the people they worked with were there for more than a decade. So it's kind of an interesting situation. So when you throw in, how do you make your contractors fully members of the team when that's appropriate versus when it's just a job to be done and then they're gone? You know, if you hire a plumber to replace a leaking faucet, that's a job and done. But if you're hiring someone to redesign your data warehouse, you don't want their expertise to go away as soon as it's built. They're going to be the most efficient person to help support that. So it's really a question of what are your needs in terms of the people in your organization? How do you find them? Because one of the really amusing things about interviewing by Zoom is you get to figure out how comfortable they are with the technology that is going to be part of their job going forward. We want people, I think that, for instance, many people now interview 3 or 4 times at a company. Maybe half of them can be done remotely. Maybe some of them can be done on site because you want to gauge both sides. Another thing that technology makes really great, I'm sure many of us have participated in interview chains. You go to a company and you speak to A from 10 to 10:45 and then B from 11 to 11:45, and you're going down the line of all the people you need to speak to. Think about doing that in Zoom with breakout rooms, where somebody is coordinating it and you have an interview in each room and you move people around. That's much more efficient. if you really want them to meet a bunch of people, and you don't need to arrange them to fly out and stay in a hotel and rent a car and do all that stuff. So you have a number of different pieces there. But the question is, how do you retain the people that you want to keep? Because I think we all recognize hiring a new person is extremely expensive. You don't want to make a mistake. And if they're a good person, you don't want to lose them. So how do you arrange that you have identified the people, whether they are a contractor or an employee, whatever their situation is, how do you keep your core team cohesive? And the new world poses many challenges and a huge number of opportunities.
Yeah, I just have to say I have lived both sides of that employee contractor thing, and I totally hear what you're saying there.
Yeah, and I just on that, I think that having a remote offices or remote staff, particularly this last year, and maybe a hybrid moving forward, hopefully will. I'm not sure how companies are doing it in terms of segregating, which I don't think it is, but just from a culture perspective, how do we know that Allan's the contractor and David's the full-time person, and do I treat them differently, right? It also reminded me of maybe how government works. There was, what was it, Yes, Prime Minister, that show from many, many years ago, whereas the career people were the ones who really ran it all, and the political appointees or the politicians were the ones that transitioned in and out and maybe changed the direction here and there, but the stuff really got done by the people who were there for long term, who in this case was the contractor. So
interesting. All right, we're going to bring Kevin back in. And Kevin, I'm unmuting you.
The theme has kind of poked up a few thoughts that I think apply broadly. One, in the recruiting for talent, I think there was a post that critical behavior interviewing has been around for a long, long time. And I think if you apply CBI to the conversation this morning, and maybe some of the panel discussions that led up to it, is what are the critical behaviors that will be successful in the situation that you're hiring for? And the point of comfort with technology, maybe they're a rural person that doesn't actually have good broadband access, so therefore the video's off most of the time. So in any case, CBI, critical behavior interviewing, just says if you can identify the right behavior, interview for that behavior. In terms of socialization, one of the consulting firms I've been working with in the last year, which has always been a little bit virtual, actually does virtual happy hours. And so there's actually a planned event. Now, frankly, they're awkward. It's a little bit different than going to a cocktail party, but at least it's an attempt to give people time just to sit back, enjoy the sunset from wherever they happen to be sitting, and socialize. And then I think a third and distinct point, but it matters, something that has always driven me crazy is when, depending on whoever made the paycheck, you're treated differently. And I come from a team sports background. You're either on the team or you're not. And the logo on your paycheck doesn't match the logo on your badge. If you're in a physical presence and you're in the room, you would have a badge that allowed you into the conference room. And so again, contractor, consultant, whether you're at Accenture or Cognizant or Pickett, you're on the team and you're there to achieve the team's mission. And I think leadership that differentiates is not leadership. Frankly, it's not leadership, but I'll leave it at that. And then to David's point, again, a little bit of another random thought, new vector, was one of the things I've done is when you're trying to build the skill, we heard, I believe yesterday, of buy what accelerates you and build what differentiates you.
yeah.
I think that was the comment, if I recall correctly. That one of the things that I've done when I've had to build a skill that we don't have, one of the things I do with the vendor, typically it's actually frankly in security because you can't buy the skill fast enough, is I will ask them, the deal will include a year of residency of a skill. Now, it may or may not be 40 hours a week. It might be 40, then 30, then 20 for cost management purposes. But the idea is have that skilled expert, that SME, subject matter expert, available to your team so they have time over target to build the skills. So in any case, those are four distinct vectors, but I think it sews together some of the things I've heard so far this morning and earlier this week.
I totally agree. I think I really that resonated with me as well. I think it was Klaus who said that: buy what accelerates you, build what differentiates you. But I do now also think it's really important to, if you do the buy, that you are leaving room to build. If it's important to build it into your team, so that it doesn't just leave the organization in the lurch.
All right, we have Martin up next. Martin, I'm unmuting you.
Thanks, Allan. Coming back on a couple of comments from earlier, the comment about you made about when you're meeting someone face to face and then doing Zoom calls and things afterwards, you build that stronger relationship, and obviously we don't have that luxury quite so much now. And I think that's something we have to kind of work through, because it's something about human nature that when you actually, as you said, go see them, spend a bit of time with them, go out to dinner. And I was in a CIO role very recently where I had people in different Caribbean islands, in Canada, in the US, and I got to see some of them before the pandemic hit. But it's definitely an issue that we're going to have to get through, and hopefully we'll get back to some of that in the future, because it builds that stronger relationship. And that was kind of the first thought. And then the second one was coming back to what David was saying around the kind of difference between permanent staff and the contract staff. I worked for a large multinational for many years. And funny enough, when I started there, aged myself a bit, in 1986, started as a graduate, I was assigned to work with this guy who was a contractor. And he is still there all these years later in that same department, in that same role, whereas everybody else has turned over multiple times. The actual permanent staff in that company move around departments, move around jobs fairly often. So sometimes, as David said, the contract staff is the only actual kind of continuing thread through some of those departments. And it's quite amusing that they are treated second-class citizens a lot of the time.
Yeah, that is a very interesting question, and it makes me wonder too about. I know that one of the nonprofits that I do work with has had some questions about the rules about when you're hiring contractors and when they have to be employees and when they're allowed to be contractors, and it gets.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other part of that equation, and not to get too deep into this separate topic, but it comes down to how Uber has had that. Uber and Lyft and all those sort of gig economy organizations have grown huge with maybe shifting people to contractors so that they save costs, and that comes into the regulatory side of things. I wanted to just touch base on, come back to the continuous learning side of things. One of the things that was raised in the panel yesterday was, you hiring obviously for their experience, but also an idea that they might learn with the organization. But in a remote environment or a hybrid environment, how are people incorporating continuous learning and team activities to advance the culture, not to overuse that word, but also make sure the organization stays lean and ready for the next challenge?
Yeah, so, I just say quickly regarding Uber and Lyft and the contract versus employee situation, there was a very interesting discussion about that on the Rationally Speaking podcast. So if you're interested in that and want to learn more, I think, I believe it's Julia Galiff did a nice job getting some different opinions on that. I'm going to go to Pat Hubble. Pat, you're up.
Hey, thanks, Allan. I was just wanted to respond to Christopher and kind of keeping people together and engaged. Again, speaking from the experience of Canderful, where we're really doing something slightly different. So you have to extrapolate or decide you can't extrapolate from our experience. But we're a highly volunteer-focused organization. Using the Uber analogy, we take a community of people from industry who do who do interviews, use them as interview coaches, as volunteers, and match them with transitioning military and veterans and military spouses. So our staff is, other than me, is volunteers. And so it may not be exactly the same, but I have to worry about employee engagement, employee volunteer engagement, since they're all remote, and they're working independently. And so I have to watch all the data that they send me about clients, and we have an operations manager who supports that as well. But keeping them happy is good. So, I'll go back to the culture is what the manager makes of it. So I do two things, again, where these are just volunteers, but I do two things to extrapolate from this if you think it's valuable. One is when they send their feedback to the clients, which we see, as often as I can, I respond with an awesome job, or even a question. I'm curious about why you chose to give that sort of feedback, and thank you for all you do. Again, volunteers not getting paid, so I have to be a little bit more gracious. But I'm trying to show them I'm watching, I'm engaged. Thank you for what you do. The second thing we do is quarterly all hands meetings, which are in our case optional because they're not employees. And we make it very relaxed. We make it meetings for them. So it's just a little bit like the cocktail hour, only we're doing it in the middle of the day and we're not doing cocktails. I'll have an agenda that will take like 10 minutes to give them updates on what we're doing. Then I'll say, let's talk. And here we have to say, and what will happen is inevitably 5 or 6 of our strongest coaches will have ideas or questions for the group, and they'll all get talking with each other, which just gets a lot of enthusiasm. It is different for non-volunteer organizations, but I think it's a concerted effort to figuring out how to engage. We have a lot more we need to do, but that was just some ideas.
Yeah. So I do want to encourage people to give us your thoughts on Christopher's question about continuous learning. But in the meantime, we have Joseph, who is coming up next. Joseph, I'm unmuting you.
Very good. Kevin mentioned something about building skills while he has the group and going to where the future is. My question is, any thoughts on mentoring or probing for key mentoring skills when you're behavioral interviewing, especially remote interviewing? Any thoughts about that?
Christopher, any thoughts off the top of your head? And we lost your...
Sorry, yeah, I was hoping to get Kevin actually to comment on that but anybody else who's been doing those styles interviews. I mean, I guess in my experience, it's and correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe I got the point of it wrong. It goes to the question that Klaus posed yesterday, which was, tell me the questions I didn't ask you, or for that matter, what do you love doing, what do you hate doing, and to get kind of underneath the, I guess, canned responses. But I'd love to hear from what Kevin has an experience on that.
Well, as a matter of fact, Kevin has his hand raised. So we're going to hear from Kevin right now.
Great. I actually posted a comment to respond to this. It's just like any other critical skill, but I think mentoring, you're looking for something different. And mentoring is an interpersonal, in my opinion. It works best when it's an interpersonal exchange that is basically based upon request. And I think if you ask the process of how that mentoring interaction started, it's a little bit like going to a therapist. The first conversation with imagine, if you will, the first conversation with the therapist is you're filling each other out and say, hey, can this person help me or not? Are they willing to help me? But I think the work environment, if they work for you, that's not mentoring. That's coaching. That's managing. Mentoring is when there's somebody that's outside your direct realm. They're asking for help. They have a problem. They want a different perspective. And I think my experience, and frankly, I was really bad at it earlier in my career, was more of exploring the options that they can consider and letting them get there on their own. And if those are the things that you think are mentoring, then just like any other critical behavior interview technique, have them tell me about a time when someone approached you for help. How did the conversation start? How did it get going? Did you prescribe or dictate, or were you more, okay, well, have you thought about A? Have you thought about B? What's most important to you? And many times this comes up, I think, when people are thinking about leaving because of family work imbalance, and they'll go to somebody outside their chain of command. So you got to explore it from the mentee's perspective, and are they getting there on their own? And the CBI type questions that you would ask just need to be more, what did they do at the time? And as managers, we have a tendency to prescribe. And so I think as mentors, we need to be able to ask questions and get the mentee to go through the thought process and recognize they're asking for help. So maybe they're not exactly thinking straight all the time, but help them get to the thought process on their own. And whatever decision, they own the decision. So I think you can ask 4 or 5 layers of questions to get there.
That's a really great point. I think it's, in my mind, it's the difference between negotiation and mediation, where in negotiation, you're really trying to arm wrestle things into a place. Mediation, you're trying to coax the parties to come to their own conclusion. It's almost like, also, to be honest, like parenting, right? I mean, we can all do everything for our kids quicker and at times, but there's no point, right, in doing that. It's best if they learn. So those are
Teach them to fish, don't give them a fish.
Exactly right. Hey, Allan, do you think we should, thanks very much, Kevin. Do you think we should pivot, it's 11:25, to cybersecurity really quickly?
Or we can. You got some thoughts on cybersecurity?
Well, I think that, we've all probably been worried about it on some level, whether our organization is secure. And obviously this pandemic has made that even more complex. So I don't know if anybody out there has any particular questions about it. I think that I'll just seed it by one of the challenges that I heard on the conversation was, that you should be able to access the code and really review the code. I mean, I think there are a couple of challenges with that. One is, do you have the skills even to interpret what the code is? And could you, as not necessarily the first person, you're a few layers removed from the actual writing of the code and whatever, could you discern an error or an issue that the quote unquote experts couldn't? So I wonder how people are viewing the cybersecurity challenge.
So I'll just say that maybe a model for that is to look at the open source community, but I'm going to bring Allan on and see what he has to say.
Well, I listened to that yesterday, and one of the chief technology officers was saying they're looking at the source. You have to have a qualified software people involved in your organizations. And most of the IT people, they are understaffed and they don't have any developments. And when this has happened before in my career with Atlantic Richfield. I don't know, some of you guys do not remember the Atlantic Richfield, the ARCO. Atlantic Richfield, they tried to do development of the software themselves. And that's not that wasn't the business of Atlantic Richfield. And it failed. It failed in other organizations. Well, I don't think any organization, IT organization, they're going to have engineers to write the code or evaluate the code. What I believe, what Kevin said, is hire your vendor and bring them in on a board to monitor and teach your people. And every time they do have a new software versions, the vendor would help you, the IT group or the organization. I don't believe you can have your own software people. They check the open source or the coding. And that's overkill, because there are hackers that are smarter than all of us these days. But the vendor, they are more smarter than the IT group. I believe on Kevin. I'm out.
Yeah, I would just say what you say reminds me of my time at Walmart. Walmart had hired IBM to come in and develop a new purchase order system for them. But we were a blended development team, half employees, half contractors, and our role as IBM consultants was to teach the employee staff to both develop and then ultimately maintain the system that we developed. So it was very interesting in the sense that we were in the lead in the beginning because, driving the design and the coding. And then ultimately, as our contract came up, the employees took it all over and were fully trained and developed. So that was my brief experience.
Yeah, and I think Thomas out in our chat room has put out a comment that I think I agree with, that vendors don't want that. They don't necessarily want that. I mean, it's complex enough, and it probably could accidentally embarrass them if some issue is found. But not to say that you shouldn't find them, but it's difficult for that vendor, relationship to completely expose yourself. So thanks for that, Thomas. So, Allan, it's 11:30. How do you want to?
Well, it is 11:30, and I think that we can at this time take a moment to thank everyone for participating in this conversation. I do encourage all of you to continue putting comments in the community. I did, of course, post a question to come up at 11:30 to encourage you to continue the conversation online. I think this experiment of having these open discussions on Thursdays so far is pretty successful. I'm liking it, and it would be good to hear what you guys say. But we are on to next week, week 4.
Thanks, everyone. It's been great.
Thanks a
Look
lot.
forward to seeing you in the community.
Bye-bye.